I want to say to the whistleblower, if the whistleblower is watching you tonight, that we are grateful for their courage in coming forward. We are going to do everything we can to make sure this urgent issue is addressed and that you are protected.
That was House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff in the last hour on MSNBC with Rachel. Joining us now is Joel Brenner, the former Inspector General of the National Security Agency under President George W. Bush from 2002 to 2006. Joel Brenner was also the head of U.S. counterintelligence in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence from 2006 to 2009. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mr. Brenner. We really appreciate it. You've been there. You've been an Inspector General.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Just give us your reading on this situation as we know it at this hour.
Look, we've got a statute here that's pretty clear on its face. You have a complaint that's come in. It does appear to be urgent. And by the way, the decision as to whether this is a matter of urgent concern that should be reported to the Congress is not a matter that under the statute is for the Justice Department, not for the president, and not for the director or acting director. It's a matter that's been left to the discretion of the IG himself, Mr. Atkinson. And Mr. Atkinson has treated this thing in the proper way and passed it within a 7-day period to the acting director who's sitting on it. Now, this is, on its face, a clear violation of the statute. So what could Mr. McGuire be saying as to why he isn't doing this? Or what could the Justice Department be saying to him? You know, it's either that they say two things. One is that this is none of the IG's business. And that's silly, and I'll tell you why, Lawrence. The statute gives the IG two different responsibilities. One is the responsibility to investigate certain things within the intelligence community. The other is to report certain things that come to his attention, whether he investigated them or not. That's what this is about. So when the White House or the Justice Department says that the IG has no business investigating this matter, it's beyond his remit, that's irrelevant. This is a matter that pertains to the operations and administration of the intelligence community, and that's why he's gone forth and doing this. And then there's the privilege issue, if you'd like me to talk about that as well. Apparently, Justice is saying there's an executive privilege here. But the executive privilege would not stand up in light of either a criminal matter, either a normal criminal matter, or a high crime and misdemeanor, if that were involved. And I think, Lawrence, that's why the president has just now taken this outlandish position that not only can a sitting president not be indicted, but he can't even be investigated. Because if he can't be investigated, nobody could try to breach his privilege with an allegation that this is a matter of criminal behavior. So we're really in some very deep constitutional water here, in my opinion.
So you don't find it coincidental that today is the day when the president's lawyers in Manhattan, as we're going to discuss with Professor Lawrence Tribe in a moment, actually filed a lawsuit saying the president is not subject to criminal process, which was something Richard Nixon would have liked to know when he was complying with criminal process and a subpoena. And the fact of the action that we're now seeing from the acting director of National Intelligence, that he is behaving, it seems, as if the president cannot be investigated.
Yeah, I think let's make a distinction, Lawrence, between an IG investigation and the president's being subjected to criminal process. I think the issue as to whether he can be subjected to criminal process would be very difficult. If he can't be indicted, I'm going to let my former teacher, Larry Tribe, talk about that one. But that has nothing to do with whether the Inspector General or the Congress could investigate criminal behavior. And if there is criminal behavior here, and if the privilege is being asserted to shield criminal behavior, I think the privilege falls apart. No coincidence here.
Let me go to a line in the law here governing the Inspector General's work and the DNI's work on this. And this is the sentence that I think the Intelligence Committee is probably worried about now, because Adam Schiff has made some public comments about the possibility of suing to obtain this. But the law says an action taken by the director or the inspector general under this paragraph shall not be subject to judicial review, which means that you cannot bring a lawsuit to sue the director based on any decision he makes under this law.
Well, but I think that statute is saying that the IG's decision cannot be subject to judicial review, which means I think the IG his discretion can't be challenged. If the IG says it's a matter of urgent concern that should be reported, I don't think somebody can go to court and challenge that. I think that's different than whether somebody could go to court and challenge the behavior of the acting director, who seems to have forgotten that his oath is to the Constitution, not to the president. You know, one sees this in former military officers who forget that they're no longer in a chain of command with a commander-in-chief at the top. They're in the civilian government now. It's quite a different thing.
Well, just take a second for that. Is that a phenomenon that you've observed, that because Joseph McGuire spent about 36 years, I think, in the Navy, and that people with long careers in the military are more accustomed to a notion of chain of command starting in the Oval Office? Yes,
I have observed that. I think look, the military has a great tradition of subordination to civil authority and to a chain of command. And when they get a command, whether they like it or not, they snap and salute. That's good. We value that. Once they're in the civilian government, they still have obligations to follow rules and follow directives from above. But he certainly didn't have an obligation, if this is what he did, to ask for advice from the Justice Department or the White House, nor did he have an obligation, I think, to follow that advice. He needs to remember who he works for, and his oath is to the Constitution, not to the president.
Former NSA Inspector General Joel Brenner, thank you very much for your invaluable perspective on this tonight. We really needed your input. Thank you. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.